Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome on stage your moderator and distinguished panelists.
Be seated. I'm John Lipsky. I'm the vice chair of the Bretton Woods Committee, and it's my honor to welcome this distinguished audience to this our Spring International Summit. And of course, we get to start with a star, the MD of the International Monetary Fund, Kristalina Georgieva, who's been generous to offer us this wonderful hall for our meeting and to join us to give her views on issues that I am sure will be of great interest to the audience. So let us begin.
Thank you very much, John. This time you promoted me. I used to be introduced, here is the host. Now you brought me into stardom. Thank you. I'm very grateful to you for bringing the Bretton Woods Committee and the people who have been supporting our institutions for years and years and years regularly to the fund. And I can start by recognizing many familiar faces, friends, advisors, people we very much value to have with us. We know that there is anxiety in the world when we check registrations for our meetings.
Yes, exactly.
Higher anxiety, more people come. In April, when we had the trade tensions, we had a record registration for spring meetings. This time around, we broke this record. And understandably so. A world economy that has been quite resilient is being tested yet again. And this time, for many countries, their capacity to respond shrunk, and they find themselves in a more difficult position. When we look at the world economy, we recognize two things. One, high level of uncertainty. It has become a permanent feature. So policymakers need to see through that fog of uncertainty. And one of the reasons they come here together is because together it is easier to do so. And second, an economy that has been building momentum. We were on the way to upgrade our growth projections, but then a sudden shock from the war in the Middle East has derailed that, and instead of upgrading, we are downgrading projections. When you go back to the factor uncertainty, that means we don't have one clean path. Instead, we are presenting, and we did this this morning, a range of scenarios depending on duration of the war and the impact it has in terms of destruction of infrastructure that could then have additional negative impact on the world. And when we look at these two factors, duration and size of destruction, if the war is to end within the next weeks, we still have a fairly rapid recovery. Yes, growth would slow down. Yes, inflation would go up, but in measurably less significant manner. If we are to have continuation and more destruction, then we are in an adverse place. In other words, if we see through the summer still the interruption in supplies continuing, then we would slow down much more significantly. And of course, there is a worst-case scenario, which I I hope we would not have to discuss, that would make this a topic of the annual meetings in Thailand. And then we risk the world economy to go so much down in growth that for some countries they would be experiencing recession. When we look at it, those of us here who have been assessing shocks, we ask how big, how spread, and how diverse are the impacts. And we can say about this shock, it is large. The 20% of oil and gas is missing for the world economy. It is global. Everybody feels the impact. Some only through prices, because oil and gas are globally traded commodities, so prices go up for everybody. But others feel it much more significantly through the slowdown in economic activity. When we look at the diversity of impact, this is where the story is really heartbreaking, because it is asymmetric impact, highly dependent on how much capacity countries have to deal with it. So who is most dramatically impacted? Poor countries, more vulnerable middle-income countries. And we will concentrate on this quadrant of vulnerability, countries that are oil and gas importers and have very limited or none in terms of fiscal space. We would discuss with countries specifically what they need so we can muster the support for them. In terms of policies, there are three things that are clear. We don't know the size of the impact, but we know that from a policy standpoint, if we have a shorter duration, monetary policy has to be on the alert. Central banks need to say, we are prepared to act, but be very careful whether they actually tighten, because then they can suffocate growth if they act prematurely. If the duration of impact is such that secondary impact on prices starts to materialize, then for many central banks, that would be the moment to act. In other words, they need to demonstrate firm commitment to price stability, but also be mindful of what may happen if they move faster than conditions required. Because we had 22, when the impression is central banks have not moved fast enough, I fear a little bit of overreaction. We always tend to correct our past mistake, and by doing so, sometimes we bring a new one to life. On the fiscal front, so the sad news here is that when you have a disequilibrium between supply and demand, you cannot get out of it with no pain. It's just not possible. And the question is how you address the pain where it is unbearable. In other words, most vulnerable people in society, if this is more prolonged and they need help, this help has to be very well targeted, and it has to be temporary. For countries that have space, they can do it without sacrificing other spending. For countries that do not have space, they have to fit it in budget as tight as that may be. And fiscal authorities should avoid the easy throw money at everybody so you keep society happy, because then you make the job of central bankers much harder. The analogy I use is that if you have central banks stepping on the brake, you do not want fiscal authorities to step on the accelerator. That's not a good way to drive a car. And I think that people understand that, but there would be pressure. Societies have become accustomed during the recent shocks to get help. And very often when help is provided, it is supposed to be temporary, but it stays longer. Very difficult to pull out. And when we look at this last year, which was a reasonably good year, very few countries used it to build fiscal space. Some did, and bravo, but many did not. And finally, what does it all mean for us at the fund? We have to be ready to step up, especially in terms of policy analysis and advice to countries, how do you deal with this uncertainty? But also for some countries, step up financially. We assessed the range of IMF support likely to be needed between $20 and $50 billion. It is not negligent, but it is not a gigantic number. Why is it not higher? And here is the best news I can present to you tonight. Because many emerging markets over the last decades have built strong fundamentals, independent central banks, fiscal councils, strong reserves. So you think of the large economies, by and large, they are in a good place. If they weren't, then of course, the world would have been in a tougher place. Fundamentals matter.
Yes. So it sounds, of course, the critical issue, a critical issue at the base is what is happening to energy markets. I think many have noted the announcement that the fund and the bank are joining with the International Energy Authority, the IEA. Could you tell us a little bit about the work and what that will do to enhance the work of the fund?
So in this crisis, the International Energy Agency is front and center in assessing what is the impact of the crisis on supplies, who is most severely affected. Asia is actually quite severely impacted. Europe comes next because of gas, helium. And what they also possess that we don't is very detailed understanding of what is happening with energy infrastructure, how much it is impacted, how long it would take for key energy facilities to come back to full deployment. We work with AIE to define what is the trajectory of impact, and then on that basis to calibrate how we can help. We join forces. Why? Because we want World Bank, IMF, and International Energy Agency for us to do joint assessments and then periodically present them. So our task is on a reasonably frequent schedule. We are thinking of every 2 weeks to have calls to look at what is happening, how does that impact our expectation, where we are, and what should policymakers prepare for. And I can tell you 2 things from this conversation that made me more alert. The first one is the head of the International Energy Agency turning to me and saying, Kristalina, why are markets so calm? Don't they understand this is really serious? And to which I said, well, you know, we experience a period of resilience. Markets, indeed, they are reacting, but orderly, and there is a little bit of tightening, but not much. And then I said, we are also hoping that the fighting would stop soon. But that is a very fair question, because the second thing he said was, March was bad, April would be much worse. Why much worse? Because all the tankers that left have reached destination. No more and yet there are not yet new tankers leaving. And I can say that the value of bringing more comprehensive understanding of what is happening in markets also help us in our policy advice. For example, we saw something very interesting. The world got more oil from the reserves. The International Energy Agency mobilized release of reserves, but it didn't have a very big impact. Why? Because a couple of countries gobbled up a big chunk of these reserves to build up their own. Mm-hmm. And countries that are in desperate need didn't see the impact. So my message this week is going to be, do no harm. Don't go in a direction of herding, taking for you, and don't block exports of petroleum products. Don't make the supply shock worse. Let's see whether people would listen.
Yes, indeed. But the hopeful message here is the fund and the bank elsewhere are paying close attention to the underlying developments in the energy sector. That you're ready with tailored advice, not one size fits all.
And not only that, but we will calibrate it regularly. So what we know today, we calibrate advice, but when we learn more, then we adjust this advice. And what I hear from the membership is they really count on us to be more agile in providing that kind of assessment and information. One of the questions I was asked was, you publish your World Economic Outlook 4 times a year. If you follow this schedule, next time you come in July, what do you do? What do we do in meanwhile? So this is why we have this 3-party coordination group to make sure there is no information vacuum.
Yes. And certainly at times like this, the fund's benchmark publications really are a benchmark and a service and something everyone looks to. A second benchmark publication was released today, the Global Financial Stability Report. And of course, there we have the challenge, not only the uncertainty of the fundamentals that we just talked about, but also some important developments in financial markets, including the growth of private credit, the unprecedented financing demands of the new technologies, especially the data centers, and the rapid growth of digital finance. All of these are potential challenges. When we think back to the global financial crisis, the underlying cause was a series of unrecognized risks in new financial instruments. What is the advice here? What is your perception of the risk here?
Well, let me start from the good news that we have seen after the global financial crisis much more alertness, much more sensitivity to assessing risks and having risk mitigation strategies. The banking sector is in a much stronger position. And when we look at this, the development of private finance, it is not yet on a scale that is particularly worrisome. Not the same when we talk about non-bank financial institutions. They are on a very large scale. And the question is, how do we go about appreciating, understanding the risks they may create? And there we know that the best way to go about it is to have more disclosure, to have more information. So how can we move in that direction of collecting data? So here is the interesting piece. There are jurisdictions that are collecting gigantic quantity of data. The United States is collecting a lot of data on hedge funds. There are some jurisdictions that collect much less. So first order of task in hand is to bring that level of information awareness up everywhere. But then the second question is how we utilize this information in a way that is a risk mitigating tool. And that's where the discussion now is. We have been working with the Financial Stability Board and BIS, the Bank for International Settlements, to define this data gap and then provide meaningful recommendation on how it can be closed. In the end, it is jurisdictions. We can recommend, but somebody has to act on the recommendation. And then comes stable coins and digital money and AI and algorithms and what they can do. And I can say in all honesty that we have a very rapidly developing capacity of AI to identify risks, but unfortunately in bad hands, possibly to create risks. And guardrails are yet to be developed. If there is something that worries me about this shock, it's actually taking attention away from very pressing issues. Among them, I would put on the top, how do we operate in a world of AI? And how we understand the financial stability risks of this world and have a way to stay ahead of them developing. There is another risk that comes from the concentration of finance in AI that you mentioned, John, and it is, what if energy prices go up and they stay very high and they make the productivity gains from AI more dubious, and then all of a sudden there is a withdrawal from these investments? And that is a very real risk that we need to be monitoring carefully and to be prepared for. How can we be prepared? By translating the risk into, again, region and country-specific bites. And that the one good thing I can tell you is that central banks are very aware that these risks exist, and there is a lot of attention concentrated on it. But let's face it, AI is here. It's actually right here in this room. I guarantee you that right now there are people that are using it. I'll tell you just to lighten up the mood. I was talking to my staff, so we have a big meeting about AI and the fund. And my starting line to my people was AI or die. And I think we need to think of AI as a very present and yet not fully integrated transformational force.
That's right. I talk to my good friend Claude all the time these days. Now,
your friend is my friend. Look at this.
Exactly. But one issue that I think is I'm sure the fund is paying close attention to, in the development of digital finance, stable coins, tokens, etc. Europe seems to be headed in one direction.
Yes.
The U.S. in another direction, and China in another direction. Is this going to lead to frictions, perhaps capital barriers, or is this something that the fund is well aware of? And
we are well aware, and there is actually a lot of work going on the interoperability of different directions countries take. I cannot guarantee we would achieve it, but I can guarantee you there is a lot of work on mapping. We are going to have more briefings on how the US is approaching stable coins, because stable coins, 98% are US dollar-based stable coins. So that's a dominance for now of the US. We have been engaging with the countries that choose different paths of payment systems, regional payment systems. And of course, what we want is not to say, no, you have to all go one way, but to make sure that there is interoperability, that these different systems can talk with each other, they can function across a board. And again, the more time we have to spend on fighting the urgent crisis, the less time we spend on the important, very important long-term transformative matters.
Yes. And in that regard, Bill, there's so many topics we could be touching on. Let me ask what we would call as Americanism, inside baseball question. One of the unique and important functions of the fund is surveillance. Mm-hmm. Our members of the fund call on the fund to be a ruthless truth teller. Mm-hmm. The fund is about to undertake a comprehensive surveillance review. What do you view as the important issues and the prospects?
So first, I want to say loud and clear that fund staff takes surveillance as our most important function, above anything else, because there is no other institution that periodically takes the vital sides of each and every economy in a fair, objective manner. We just completed recently 2 very big surveillance, Article 4 for China, Article 4 for the United States, and I recommend look at those. They show that we do that with integrity, we do it fairly, we assess what goes well, where the problems are, and what may be a way to address these problems. You wouldn't be surprised, in the case of China, a big chunk of attention was on industrial policy, how it may be impacting productivity in China negatively. We actually calculated that China loses 1.2% productivity because of misallocation coming from industrial policy. And a lot was about China's now determination to switch its growth model from one that is based on exports to one that is based on domestic consumption, and move away from goods more towards services. Whereas in the US, a big part of the Article 4 was about the fiscal policy in the United States. We agree with Secretary Bessent that there more needs to be done to bring down deficit, and actually, for fairness, last year the US has seen a modest decrease in the deficit. So we do that now. And the question is, how can we improve surveillance? We do these surveillance reviews, comprehensive surveillance reviews, periodically. What are we asking? Well, we are asking, one, what are the issues that in the last 5 years came to be very significant? In the past, we didn't so much integrate them. Now we have to. We just talked about financial stability risks from AI. We talked about stablecoins, digital money, payment systems. This is becoming more significant, so our comprehensive surveillance review will have to reflect on it. In the past, we would do individual countries, and that's that. We only have Eurozone surveillance for the Eurozone because of the common currency, because of the euro. But in a world in which regional integration in other parts is becoming quite significant, in a world where globally trade may not be as prominent, but the response in many parts of the world, in ASEAN, in the Gulf Cooperation Council, of course, they now are experiencing a massive shock. That has developed further. So we want to think of ways in which we can use surveillance in a regional context as well and be more helpful to countries to harmonize their policies. We have a very big question to answer this year, next year, on global imbalances. Why is this an important question? Because they were going down, and now they're going up again. And everybody who knows what happened last time when they were going up would say, do something about it. We had the global financial crisis that corrected imbalances, forced correction in imbalances. So we want to look at what can be done in national policies where this is an important topic that would help the national economy, the country, and would help the global economy. So we look at these issues that are either becoming more significant or are relatively new, and we have to deal with them. A very big question that countries are asking is how they can rely more on domestic savings and local currency markets. How can they create capital markets based on their currencies? It's a question that occasionally we look into, sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. Should we make this a more prominent part? How can we think about structural policies that are pro-growth in a world where growth has been somewhat disappointing? So that is how we want to use the surveillance review to make the fund more useful, more helpful to our members. And I can again repeat that somebody told me that they saw a comment that the fund is abandoning surveillance. Nothing can be further from the truth. And you hear this from the horse's mouth.
The star's mouth. Now, you mentioned the issue of global imbalances. There have been a plethora of recent reports and very serious reports in this area, the G7 and the CEPR, et cetera. Is this a topic that the fund is going to address separately, or is it inherent in the work, the World Economic Outlook and other work?
We have a separate work path that is specifically dedicated to imbalances, and we are doing it because of that recognition that they have started dangerously going up. We will be, actually there is a seminar here, I think it's tomorrow, a discussion on global imbalances, and we are bringing these people that have written reports. We would have Andrew Bailey, so this is a promo. I'll be on the panel. We have Andrew Bailey, the Bank of England wrote a very substantive report, and we would have one of the 4 authors of the G7 report on imbalances. Helen would be with us. I think it is a topic that requires not only understanding of the technicality, but also political economy issues. How can we convince countries to take action that they can internalize is in their own interests? So it is for the bigger public good, but it is also good for them. And that's our job. That's what we do.
So be sure and attend tomorrow. The fund, the challenges that you've pointed out for emerging markets, especially the asymmetric challenges, are the fund's financing facilities well adapted for this situation, or is more changes needed or new facilities required?
So we are in a very good place in terms of our tools to support countries. Because of the shocks we have already gone through, we have modernized our instruments. Just to give you a couple of examples, we have made our emergency financing more robust, more reliable, with much better understanding as to how we would then assess the use of money. We have gotten our precautionary instruments in very good place, And we have made the financials, what we charge for lending, appropriately calibrated. Our board of directors is fully aware that this new shock would create new push for the fund to step forward. And as I said, after this week, we will define where, why, what, in what manner. Currently, we have 39 programs. And we can use some of these programs to augment them and support countries that are hit by this shock and they need help. We have plenty of money to lend. We also have plenty of subsidy resources to lend to low-income countries through PRGT. But you would hear us flagging to the membership, we did a reform of PRGT that allows us to use some of our own income to place in the subsidy account so we can lend low cost to low-income countries. It requires all our members to give us their consent, to say, yes, you can use my share of income. And so far, we have gotten close to 50%. People know that the deadline, we gave a very long deadline. We don't need the money right now, by 2030. And what I'm afraid is that when we put this deadline, we didn't anticipate the frequency and severity of shocks. Mm-hmm. So we may need the money earlier. We need to get the membership to move. Actually, the biggest difficulty is for Eurozone members, because for them, they need to be sure this is not monetary financing. The European Central Bank has to vouch for that. Some of the central banks went into a loss-making situation. We are hoping that would change. The short and the long is we need the money.
And I hope you get it.
And I hope to get it.
Now,
yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
And just to say one more thing that we do need, and it is, we have a special instrument that allows us to give grants to the poorest of the poor, 29 poorest countries, if they have obligations towards the fund, but an exogenous shock makes it impossible for them to serve these obligations. During COVID, that was a lifesaver. We have provided grants to, I think, 27 countries. So for 2 years, rather than having to take away from, feeding their people and educating their people to pay the fund, they could use these grants to cover their obligations. That was meaningful debt relief. But there was a big shock, and we run almost entirely out of money. So we need to raise money, and raise money at a time when it is so difficult. I think we will be asking our members again, think of ways in which we can use either our own income, or you can put some of your SDRs in an investment account to generate money, so we are not broke at the time when we may need to help the poorest countries again.
Well, good luck on that. And that's, I think, a good note to end on.
Put a good word. If you talk to friends,
yes,
put a good word.
Exactly. Kristalina, thank you so much for joining us, for sharing your views and your hospitality.
Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon. My thanks as well to everyone for joining us. I'm Rebecca Patterson, Vice Chair of Bretton Woods Committee, and Ajay Banga, President of the World Bank. We're so delighted to have you back with us here today. It's always really an honor to get to talk to you.
Thank you. It's lovely to see so many old friends in the room, so thank you. Thank you. Complicated times, but.
Indeed. All right. And it's not even a lot of stuff. It's stuff moving at different speeds. And I think you've talked about the world this way, that you have these high-frequency events, crises. I would say what we're living through today in the Middle East would be one of those. But in addition to that, you also have these structural changes or lower frequency events taking place, whether we're talking about artificial intelligence, which is fast and slow,
yep.
demographics, climate, et cetera. Oh, thank you. Such a gentleman. And so...
Gotta get your interviewer on the right side.
So, I'd like to talk a little bit about both of these with you today in our time together. A little bit about some of the fast things happening that you have to respond to in the minute, and then also at the same time managing these other slower moving forces. But let's start with what's front and center this week, which is the war in Iran and the conflict in the Middle East generally. And I'd love to hear how you and the World Bank are thinking about helping the countries getting hit by this, and especially, the lower income economies, the energy importers who get hit harder than everyone else. And we've got the crisis response window that was created more than a decade ago, which can provide immediate liquidity to some of these countries. What are you doing right now, and what are you getting ready in case this crisis continues? What would be the next steps, too?
So actually, that particular crisis response window and allowing people to get access to 10% of their undisbursed balances wasn't created a decade ago. It was created 2.5 years ago.
Oh,
and
my
it
bad.
existed in a different form earlier.
Okay.
And now it's got a whole series of toolkits attached to it, one part of which is the rapid response option of disbursing. And another part is if it's a climate event that caused it, you can suspend both debt and interest payments for 2 years. And so there's different elements behind the crisis response toolkit, but they were mostly designed to give people breathing room when the water's here kind of thing. So anyway, back to your bigger question, the Middle East. The way I think about the Middle East situation is that, first of all, I think April will be a more complicated month than people currently think, because all the oil that was on sea in March has reached wherever it had to reach. And nothing else is left through that strait in March. So April's going to be harder in some ways, and I presume the market's perfectly priced for it, but I don't know that for sure. So I think that's going to be a little complicated. Second, and this is not a question of whether the peace agreement sticks or doesn't stick, whether miraculously the strait opens up or not. Whichever way, if it does stick and the strait opens up, you're still looking at a few months of correction before flows and supply systems catch up with where they were. I mean, you got, Iraq, for example, has got oil wells being shut down because they don't have storage.
Right.
And when you shut an oil well down, it's not like opening a tap. You kind of don't open it again. It takes a lot of work and expense and care. And if you keep it closed for too long, it deteriorates anyway. So that's Iraq. On the other hand, you have Nigeria, which has both oil and refining thanks to Dangote's $20 billion investment. So they've got an inflation issue, not a availability issue. So, and then you've got, countries in Asia, and by the time you get to a Bangladesh or others, they've got other challenges, both in terms of availability and price. And by the time you get to small islands, then it's yet another issue. So I think you've got to remember that it's not one size fits all. And so everything we are doing to respond to it is calibrated for the country. So we've got 3 things we're working on. And the first one is, can we, through this rapid availability of money, how much can we put out to work? And if you look at the countries that signed for that crisis response toolkit and some of the projects we put these clauses into, you can probably get to $20-25 billion that could be pulled by finance ministers like now, in 5 minutes. And that's real money.
Has anyone tapped it yet?
Not yet, because they're all trying to figure out what and how much they will need. And I'll come to also the obvious challenge of fiscal challenges for everyone. This is not grant money.
Yeah.
So you got to be a little careful of that. So we'll come to that in a minute. The second is, if this continues for 6 months or more, then can we repurpose some of our existing projects and guide them towards the kinds of things that may be helpful to these countries? If you do that, we think we can get to 50, 60 billion from the 2025 I started with, meaning another 30 to 40 billion bucks. If it goes beyond that, then we're going to have to start pulling into our balance sheet and headroom to see what we can do. But over 15 months, we think we could get to 80, 100 billion. Remember, these are not incremental numbers. I'm talking about the total. It's 80, 100, including the 2025 and the extra, a total of 100. And that's over and beyond our normal lending at that time. So just to give you a context, in COVID, the bank put 70 billion to work. So I'm trying to create a toolkit that has a tiered response capacity, depending on how this continues, to at least be able to bring adequate firepower to do something about it. That's the first one. Second point is trying to make sure that people do no harm in terms of their own fiscal circumstance, and obvious things like targeted subsidies to poorer populations rather than an overall drop in price of petroleum and so on. But it's really easy to say that. It's really hard to imagine a politician on the ground in a developing country who's facing an election in 8 months' time. And so you've got to just, this is great on a stage. Ain't that great on the ground? So I don't know that I can tell you with absolute certainty that every country that pulls in some of this money will necessarily do it transparent, targeted, and temporary. I just don't know that for sure. But that's going to be our best effort so you can keep the fiscal circumstance and damage down through this crisis.
Yeah. And we've talked before on this stage, and you've been doing work on this for a long time, about the structural part of energy, right? So we're dealing with this immediate crisis, and it's not just energy. Of course, we know there's a lot of other materials that go through the strait which are causing additional problems.
Fertilizer, sulfur,
exactly.
Helium,
But there's also the structural energy element, and we can get to AI later, but there's a demand for electricity for some of the countries that you're focused on, energy in general, to get living standards up. So you've got the immediate crisis, but then you also have the structural element. Are those things just completely separate in your mind, or is there some overlap today when you think about something like Mission 300?
Yeah, no, look, we've all got to learn how to walk and chew gum at the same time. This is not, if you think that I can just switch my mind off from all this and only focus on one thing, very soon your people in your country are going to remind you that that's not adequate. So I think everyone's aware that you don't control the immediate impact of the conflict, but you do control how you respond. And I think you've got to respond in the short term for what you can to reduce the pain and manage circumstances. And all I'm saying there is, don't think of this as 1 month more of pain. Think of it as longer than that, because it'll take time for the supply system to settle down, even assuming that there's no more fighting and therefore no more structural damage to energy installations, right? But in the meanwhile, you've got to do other things. And one of the reasons why our spring meeting focus was on reforms and governance is because there is no way that private money is going to come to work in an emerging market, and without private money, there is not enough public money in the developed world, let alone in the developing world, to do the kinds of things you need to do to meet the aspirations of 1.2 billion young people coming through the pipe in the developing world in the next 15 years to be 18 years of age. There is no way you can do that with public money. So you have to get private money in. Private money comes where it feels the risk-reward equation is worth its while. If there are investors behind it, that's how they're going to choose to do it. So how do you work with them? And one of the best ways to do that, in addition to building the right physical and human capital foundation, which is pillar one of our job strategy, the second pillar is get the right reforms in place. And I keep trying to explain this to people that it's reforms across entrepreneurs, micro and small enterprises, medium-sized and large companies, because large companies actually create 20% of the jobs. They're useful to help the others get the momentum and to create the virtual cycle that forces them to create jobs. But jobs come in the micro and small and medium-sized enterprises, even in America.
Yeah.
And so what we have to think about is how do you get those people working? And if you look at the kind of regulations that could improve things for them, for a micro or small entrepreneur, it'll be less bureaucracy in opening a business, basic financial tools, things of that nature. By the time you get to being a medium-sized company or small-sized company, it's access to working capital. It's the availability of things like competition law doesn't matter often to a small or medium enterprise. It matters to the bigger ones. So does fitting into a value chain, a global value chain, so customs rules that are better facilitation, digital facilitation, that kind of thing. Everybody, each one of these groupings of companies needs the right governance and the right regulations. That's what we're trying to focus on. And I don't think you can divorce any of the medium term, whether it's M300 for energy or it's 1.5 billion people we're trying to connect with healthcare, or it's AgriConnect and food and small farmers and their future, or it's water, which is the other big element of our Springs meeting here, where we're trying to reach 1 billion people with our MDB partners in getting to water security by 2030. So none of these is divorceable from today's crisis, but none of them will get done if all you do is focus on today's crisis.
Right.
That's the issue.
Yeah. And one of the pieces of that you just mentioned, all the young people. So it's the demographic mismatch in the world today is so interesting to me. You've got some countries in the world where you have aging populations, now shrinking labor forces or entire populations. They need more workers. America needs more workers. Or we're going to see growth decline unless AI miraculously pushes up productivity to offset that completely, which is a question, not a given. But then you have countries with so many young people and not enough jobs for them. And what I hear you saying is that if we can't create the conditions for them to be able to start companies or enter companies, then we could have another immigration crisis on our hands at a time where populations have become a lot more inward looking. Okay, we want to get them water, we want to get them electricity, we want to get them the right regulations, the right governance. How optimistic that you can get all these things to align, and over what time frame?
You can. If you focus on jobs, be careful about the word jobs, because a lot of people think all I'm doing is talking about large companies, and I keep trying to make the case that please don't take that impression away. We're doing a bunch of things with entrepreneurs, with small and medium-sized companies. So it's really the chance to be productively employed in your society that we're talking about. The shorthand for that is job. It's actually not the correct explanation for it. Look, of that 1.2 billion, right now, if you looked at these same emerging markets, we're talking about 400 million jobs being created in those markets over 15 years. Now, those estimates are made by economists that live in these two buildings, so I'd be a little careful assuming they're correct. But we can't be wrong by 800 million people. We may be wrong by 100, by 200, but that's a lot of people. Now, if you get them working in the right environment, which means you start creating new markets for consumption and the like. By the way, a lot of this growth will come in Africa. And I think Africa could be what Asia was for the world's economy for the last 30, 40 years, a huge engine of growth. It could be Africa that does that. Could be. But for that to happen, for them to grow, to consume, to become middle class and that kind of thing, and therefore the benefits to our companies of products, intellectual property, technology, and the jobs, that symbiotic cycle of benefit for both of us, that isn't a given. And if it does happen, then it's great. And if it doesn't happen, then I think you run the risk of a dystopian situation where you'll get illegal migration at a much higher level than what has existed in the past. I mean, Europe has 600,000 illegal migrants 2 years ago and 3 million legal. But if you ask the average European in the street, they would first of all think it's the other way around, which is a perception issue, not a reality issue, but reality is half perception. And or whatever it is, the other way around. I think I mixed it up. Whatever, that thing. But if you allowed this African situation to develop without new jobs of the type we need, then I think you're looking at 5 and 10 million migrants a year, not 600,000. Now, you tell me how European society will deal with that. And so I think this is quite an urgent issue. Can it be done? Yes. If you get away from the natural divisions of our world, where all of us either want to finance this aspect of healthcare or that aspect, a school here, a bridge there, everybody's got their pet stuff. When you go and talk to country leaders, even they do this. They will tell you, hey, I'm going to get all these great doctors back. My diaspora is living in England and America, and they're amazing doctors. I'm going to put up this fabulous hospital in my leading capital city, and it's going to be great. I'm like, that's the worst way of dealing with it. Because what you're doing is, I was actually in Egypt where we were having this discussion, and I said to President al-Sisi, I said, sir, country of pyramids. How do you build a pyramid? From the tip or the foundation? It's the foundation. And the foundation is primary healthcare. You got to deliver that. You'll never bend the curve on healthcare if all you do is build hospitals. It's the most expensive way to try and deal with a population's healthcare needs. And so if you start getting away from the idea of financing what's your pet project, but you get behind the idea of creating jobs, then, to me, getting the right foundations, physical, but also human capital, getting the right business rules, and then getting catalytic capital to work are important. And we've identified 5 sectors through our Jobs Council, run by Tharman and Michelle Bachelet and a bunch of CEOs and civil society. These 5 sectors are actually less reliant on trade, and therefore the outsourcing of jobs based on labor or cost arbitrage. And one is infrastructure. It's construction, but then what it enables.
Right.
The second is agriculture for small farmers. Yes, to keep them in productive circumstances through cooperatives and scale in their farm, but then the downstream and upstream jobs that creates. Third is primary healthcare. And I'm talking about distributed clinics where you've got a nurse, a medical diagnostic technician, and a midwife. And then 10 clinics shared with one doctor using simple AI and digital technology to help access to scale, and then 20 doctors with one regional hospital. That's the pyramid I'm talking about. And then tourism, which creates the most jobs per dollar invested. And then value-added manufacturing, not just of minerals and metals that the emerging markets are blessed with and that we need, but even creative industries. I mean, Africa is a hotbed of creative industry opportunity. Bangladesh, huge opportunity. And so if you think through these 5 sectors, there are also sectors that don't get impacted immediately by AI. They may get impacted, the last one particularly, by technology and automation, but less so by AI. And so these are very carefully chosen, and they fit almost most countries where we need to work. Infrastructure, agriculture, primary healthcare, tourism, and value-added manufacturing.
Right.
Whether as an entrepreneur, small company, or large company. I think you can do it, but you got to. And then whether you're building a bridge, or you're building a school, or you're building a healthcare clinic, it's connected to the idea of creating jobs as the natural outcome of what you're doing.
And I think what you said briefly earlier, I just want to echo because it's such an important point. After the last 20 years, there's a lot of worry in countries about just anxiety that something is going to be taken from them, whether that a job is outsourced to another country or AI takes their job. And that's created some of this anxiety around immigration and outsourcing. So the point you're making is that these industries will create stronger global growth, which benefits everyone.
And jobs there.
And doesn't take a job away from an advanced economy.
There.
Right. But can we talk about...
Talent is everywhere, but opportunities are not. I'm trying to change that equation.
Yeah.
That's all I'm trying to work on. Capital has to come from certain places which have more capital than the others. There is some capital in these countries, particularly in the small company area, but the larger companies, the capital has to come in. But the capital won't come without the right risk-reward equation, which is the stuff we're doing with our private sector work. I'll give you a number. 9 months' time of this fiscal year, 2 numbers, 73 billion and 53%. 73 billion is the private capital mobilization we did at the World Bank Group in the first 9 months of this year. 53% is the growth over last year. It is possible.
What do you
in
think,
this environment.
What drove the growth? What changed?
Work on each of these items. Regulatory policy clarity. We discussed this last time. Our guarantee platform, which is now growing. This year, last year was 15 billion. We think we'll get to the 20 that we want to earlier than 2030. The third is local currency financing. IFC now is 40% local currency financing. It was 25% 3 years ago. That changes the risk-reward equation.
Yeah.
Fourth is junior equity. So we've got a junior equity funds going now. We're taking first loss or capped returns in a number of these projects. And the last one, which is to me the most exciting but the hardest to work on, is the originate to distribute idea.
Yeah.
And Doug Peterson, who used to be at S&P and is an old colleague of mine from Citibank, is actually helping me run this for across the MDBs. We're trying to create a emerging markets class in MDB loans,
Right.
Which could be packaged together and then sort of certified by a rating agency as being, say, B- and available at 90 cents to $1, at which point pension funds, insurance companies, and their CIOs will say, I need this much B- paper. If I can get a certain amount of it regularly, I will invest in it. Expecting the Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan to purchase every water loan we make in Africa is like taking a knife to a gunfight. You'll lose. It's not going to happen. Because they don't operate like that. They don't do loan-by-loan underwriting.
Right.
That's not their expertise.
No.
So we've got to build what we need for them and then see if we can get them to be part of the solution. It's the most interesting one. I had told you when I met you last time that I think that's a 3 to 5 year effort. We're into our second year of it. I actually think we're making progress.
That's great. That's great. That would move the
Real
needle.
progress.
I want to go back to AI because that's another topic. If we weren't in the middle of a war in the Middle East right now, I think that would be a dominant focus of the conversation this spring. Depending on the country you're in, you know, who thinks they're going to win, how are they going to win, who's going to lose. But when you talk about, you know, a lot of the emerging markets, I hear different things. I hear we could leapfrog. Right? So you think about countries like India and DPI and small AI and how things could be deployed across the country very effectively. And then you think about, well, yeah, but you need electricity, you need water, you need skills training. So how are you thinking about AI, especially with these 5 sectors of jobs and these goals you have? There's constraints. There are things missing from these countries, but there's also a huge opportunity.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, large language models and generational AI, big AI, is what captures everyone's imagination. And rightly so. It is revolutionary and it could be enormously productive and enormously challenging at the same time. And no one knows the answer.
Right.
So therefore it's captured everyone's imagination in a story of, you know, a tale of two cities, right? Depending on which city you're looking at it from. What that needs is 4 things. Computing power, lots of it. Electricity, lots of it. Data, bless you, kept in its simplest form, accessible to everyone, because if it's not simple as data, you can't combine it, but it has to be kept with privacy and security.
Right.
And the more the data you have, the more predictive the model. Therefore, if people start doing data management and not allowing data to flow across their borders, that's bad for large language models, which no one's talking about right now. But you know that data sovereignty will become a national security issue sooner or later. Just as energy security now has suddenly become a national security issue, and you know, you've got to wake up and smell the coffee that the Hormuz Strait is 25 kilometers wide. So it's kind of unfortunate, but we are there today. So and then the last thing you need is people who know how to do all this. There are very few emerging markets who have those. I would argue even the developed world is challenged on electricity and the management of data. And therefore, by the time we reach an emerging market, it's even less likely to work well. One of the reasons why I pushed the energy policy change that the bank did last year, where I insisted that we reopen the nuclear financing discussion, and I insisted that the bank get active in mid and downstream gas as a part of a country's energy transition, was that I do not believe that countries can compete without basic baseload kind of power, affordable and accessible. And you cannot do that if your hands are tied behind your back in terms of the kind of capacity you're going to need to manage this digital transition. Now, small AI is different. And what Prime Minister Modi was talking about at the AI summit in India is kind of where I'm going for the emerging markets. And my belief is that small AI is how you keep the emerging markets in the AI game. So the 5 sectors I gave you, take agriculture. I saw this working, by the way, in Uttar Pradesh in India. These illiterate village women were using a phone on a platform that Google had built for us, pro bono, which is like a connective tool where farmers and cooperatives on this side connect with insecticide, fertilizer, water, crop insurance vendors on this side. And she basically showed me how she was able to speak into a phone, because she can't write, and take a photograph of the scar, the disease on the back of a leaf. And it doesn't tell you what it is, because even I can't pronounce those crazy names. But it tells you this insecticide for 25 rupees from your cooperative is the way to kill this problem. That to me is small AI, delivered at the edge, local compute, perfectly sensible, doesn't require large amounts of electricity, doesn't require data to be shared across 35 countries for it to work. This is eminently usable today. Same thing in healthcare. That primary healthcare example, I'm the nurse, you're the patient, you walk in. I'm in this healthcare clinic in rural Kenya. And you say, I've got a rash here, and I kind of look at it, and you don't. I'm just kidding. Okay. And I say, I don't know what it is. But I take a photograph and I send it to this lady who's my doctor. I share her with 10 other clinics. And she looks at it and runs it through a simple AI tool and says, it's just eczema. Give her this ointment and tell her to go away. Or she says, I don't like it. She needs to come to a regional hospital in 14 days, and here's the appointment. Mm-hmm. This is not rocket science. This is eminently doable today with simple AI, without large language models and gobbledygook. And that's what I'm trying to do. Mm-hmm. So to me, small AI, used the right way, will enable all those 5 sectors in the emerging markets in a way that enables the emerging markets to be beneficiaries of the concept of AI, without only thinking about what they're losing by not being able to do what everybody else is talking about in LLM and generational AI. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be concerned about what could be the great opportunities from LLM and the others. I think there's amazing things that will come out of there. And it doesn't mean we shouldn't be concerned about the problems with those either.
Right.
Just for the emerging markets, can we please focus on small AI, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the end.
I have one more question, which is the big $1 million question for you today. So you ready?
Sure.
Okay. You're always ready. So.
Do I have a choice?
No, you don't. You're up here in front of all of them. Like So you got.
Great question.
You have no.
You're ready.
Yeah. Okay. So, I think more and more policymakers are now publicly stating that the world order that we've been used to for the last 80 years is gone. And it's not clear what's going to replace it. I feel like most think tanks that I'm aware of or involved with are working on various projects to try to figure out what the next chapter looks like for the world. No one's sure. How are you navigating this? How are you managing the World Bank through this period where no one really knows what comes next? And what are the countries you're working with asking from you to help them get through it? Like we're all kind of going into this unknown together in some ways.
So look, I think that in the developed world, which is where financing comes from typically for the effort to be driven. Remember, we need financing for IDA every few years because we give away 1/3 of it without interest, without repayment of capital as a grant to the 78 poorest countries. But the rest of it, we're able to leverage 4 times through our AAA rating. And the rest of the bank, IBRD, IFC, is 10 times leverage. And those are profitable in themselves enough to remain above the water and therefore not require new capital injections unless your ambition of size of work changes. So in that context, I just went through an IDA replenishment last year. And we raised a record amount of 24 billion, which at leverage gives me 100 billion to work with, which is the highest we've ever had. Now, that's also the same time period that the following things happened. Japan, government fell, a new government came, had an election in the upper house, lost the majority there, had another election, lost it in the lower house, new government's in. All in the course of that year.
Yep.
Let's get to France. How many governments has France had?
Tier 4 or 5?
3.
Yeah.
3.
Okay. Feels like Italy.
3. But Italy actually is the most stable right now. So that's an interesting commentary, right? She's been around for a while. Therefore, actually, Prime Minister Meloni is the most stable leader in Europe today in terms of being.
See, I told you it's a new world order.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's a good world order, that part of it. So she's good. She's terrific. If you go through others like that, Korea, on the day of our IDA pledging event, which Seoul was hosting, declared martial law at 3 o'clock that morning with 5,000 delegates of mine sitting in Seoul. Just to have a little bit of fun with that. Then let's keep going. Canada, government falls, election has to happen. Germany, Christian Lindner quit the government of Olaf Scholz.
Yep.
That government fell, election had to happen. The British government changed, and the US government changed. And all people talk to me about is the US government. What you're not realizing is, through that period, we had to deal with all our large shareholders going through enormous change. And every new government would say to me, what's in it for me to work with you? And my point to our colleagues in the bank is the following. It is not a birthright for you to expect that money will come from the rich world to go to the poorer world because of some guilt trip. That's over. You've got to earn that money by explaining to them why it's in the benefit of their taxpayer to be used this way, the symbiotic relationship we talked about earlier, the value of development, how it could help things for taxpayers in these different countries, what the leverage of the bank provides, what our knowledge base provides for this development exercise, and therefore why we are a trustworthy party in this process. And the United States committed $3.2 billion to us in IDA, which is exactly what we had in the prior IDA. So just to be clear, it isn't exactly what you think it is. And so you got to make an effort to get there. It's not as simple as it used to be. It can feel challenging at times. There are days when I go home and think, why the hell am I doing this again? But then I come back in the morning and I get completely rejuvenated by the people I meet and the idea of jobs. And, I'll give you an example. We had a corporate scorecard of 155 items when I joined. We've now got 22. And to be completely clear, as of this week, you will be able to go on a website, you, private citizen, click on any of the 22 and track exactly how we are doing versus our promises every day. That's transparency. Why? Because sunlight is your best disinfectant.
Yes.
And if I can create that culture, I will make mistakes. We will make mistakes. But I will be willing to say that I'm focused and driven to get these jobs thing done. And that involves everything from resilient infrastructure to schools that are hurricane-proof, to roads that are monsoon-proof, to seeds that are, heat resistant, to drip irrigation, to nuclear energy, to healthcare clinics, to vaccinations, to polio, to malaria. It includes everything as compared to dividing ourselves up into, I'm going to do this, this, and this. How about doing what young people actually want for their future? Give them a chance.
Your passion inspires me, and we are so grateful for your leadership and for your time today. And I can't wait to continue tracking these metrics and watching the success.
And don't yell at me each time about them. They won't all work. They won't work all well.
I would never yell. Me? Sweet me? Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Guys.
Thank you, everybody.
It's my pleasure to introduce President Christine Lagarde to the stage, please. So welcome.
Thank you, Bill.
It's so good.
Lovely to be here.
It's so,
and lovely to see so many friends here.
yeah, it's like you're coming home, right? Yeah. So I'm going to jump right in. World Economic Outlook came out today, and as you might expect, growth down, inflation up, reflecting obviously what's going on in terms of the war and the impact on energy prices. So when you look at it from the European Union perspective, ECB perspective, what's your view in terms of how this is going to affect the European outlook? Base case, adverse case, severe case. Where are you in terms of your forecast, and how's that evolving? Are you sort of moving from one case to the other?
Well, it's what the head of the International Energy Agency has called the worst shock on a global basis that we could have. So if you start from that basis, wherever you're located in your region and as a central banker, you look at the impact it can have on your economy. You look at the impact it has on inflation, which is clearly mission critical for us central bankers. You look at the impact it has on growth, and you try to navigate to see on the basis of the best possible information, and I can come back to that in a second if you want, what is the likely baseline. And given the level of uncertainty that we are facing, we work with scenarios. We have a variety of them. We select the ones that are most relevant for the purpose of publication and communication with markets and with whoever is interested in the work that we are doing. And we also pay great attention to risks around the baseline. And it's all of that is terribly unfortunate, okay? And when I look at the death, the casualties, the destruction, it's highly unfortunate. Where we are fortunate in Europe and particularly at the ECB, is that we had developed a strategy back in 2021, because it took a little bit of time because of COVID to complete the exercise. But as soon as I took the job, I decided that we should conduct this strategy review, and we have just recently updated the strategy. So, two findings from that strategy review. One is we need to incorporate risk analysis into our thinking, much more so. And second, we need to use scenario analysis. Surprise, surprise, it's extremely helpful now, and I'm delighted.
Especially when the outcomes are very wide, right?
Yeah. When you have a very high level of uncertainty and you are uncertain about some of the numbers and the facts that we are observing, it's really good to be able to do that. The second aspect that makes us a little bit more fortunate in this unfortunate situation is that we were nicely positioned.
You were on your inflation target.
We were, we had...
Unlike some other unnamed...
No, I won't go there. But look at it, we were, growth was on its way up. We were in a recovery process. We were just about to upgrade our projections. Inflation was at our target and had been for almost a year. So we were really confident that we had tamed inflation as it was, and the unemployment level was at rock bottom. We never had an unemployment level so low. So that
gives you
eventually
credibility,
put us,
right? That gives you credibility in terms of going forward.
I hope so. I hope so.
I think it does.
And but it puts it. We are in a good position to now respond to the situation and be able to demonstrate the level of agility to calibrate the response depending on the facts and on the data that we are trying to collect, ascertain, correlate, verify, because that's an area where we need to constantly do some work. So you asked me about whether we are constantly updating, and yes, we are. So we are not, publishing on a weekly basis. Of
course.
But yes, we are constantly updating, and as I was saying earlier today, it makes our job particularly difficult at the moment, and it gives us that level of schizophrenia, as I mentioned, because we need to be focused on our time horizon, which is the medium term. That's where we want to be.
Because monetary policy takes
Because
time to
monetary
work.
policy is medium-term target.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we have to be constantly aware of almost the daily evolution of the overall situation and the market situation as well.
So where are you today in terms of thinking about the outlook for ECB monetary policy? Are we in a wait to see which of these scenarios sort of materializes, or how long can you wait?
We have three. We have one baseline, which is the one that we believe is reasonable and sensible to anticipate, which has helped us give our revised projection with growth down, inflation up, and that over the course of 26, 27, 28, because we conducted a 3-year exercise. And in addition to that, we have constructed and published with all the hypotheticals and with all the assumptions and with zero monetary or fiscal reaction incorporated in the scenarios, we have what we call an adverse scenario and a severe scenario. And the two factors that change between the adverse and the severe is the peak at which oil and gas go and the length of time that it takes for both oil and gas and every derivative products to go back to normal.
So presumably right now we're sort of in the baseline or a little bit beyond the baseline. We're sort of marching towards the adverse.
Yeah. No question. And we don't update on a daily basis, but it changes on a daily basis. So we have to update regularly and be mindful of potential changes.
How do you think about the shock of, in terms of inflation? A lot central bankers like to talk about transitory shock. We can look through transitory price changes.
Yeah, I've heard that story.
Yes. How do you think about how strongly can you hold to that belief, and at what point does inflation become high enough for long enough that it's no longer tenable to look through that transitory shock?
When obviously the teams look at it very carefully, and historically, energy shocks in Europe have been rather transitory. And in the past, monetary policies in those days could just look through it, wait until it comes back. Because we cannot, as a central bank, as you know very well, we cannot, reduce the energy prices.
Right.
This is something that is external. It has predominantly a supply dimension until it's, something happens. But this is not something that we can affect. I think what we need to do on the basis of current circumstances is assess the data, determine the actual nature of the shock, the possible variation of that nature, the magnitude, the potential duration, and then we have to be open. And we cannot, I think it would be a serious mistake today to say this is a case of look through. We simply don't know.
Too soon to tell.
Too soon to tell. So where we will move and demonstrate our agility is once we have enough data, enough information, and once that is the case, then we will not be hesitant. But if for those of you who really look at the ECB position, we have laid it out very clearly in a speech that I gave recently to the ECB watchers, which divides our approaches and our potential stance into 3 categories. One where it's transitory, we look through it, and it's relatively short-lived, and it comes back to previous or more or less previous situation. We don't do anything.
Right.
And we see how the situation evolves. The second, at the other opposite, is it's a long-lived, quite.
And then you have to worry about getting into wages and getting into expectations.
It's a long-lived, sustainable energy shock, which has the direct effect, which has the indirect effect, which has eventually the risk of second-round effect. And then we have to be so attentive to inflation expectations that it requires for us to take decisive measure. And then you have anything in between these two, which may or may not require that we act upon the situation. But the key certainty that I have is that, number one, we will not let inflation expectations be de-anchored, and we will deliver and continue to deliver on our mission to keep prices stable, which means 2% medium term.
No,
that is
absolutely
what I'm certain of.
I want to switch gears, and you've talked about the erosion of trust in multilateral institutions. How serious do you think the damage is, and what should be done to sort of bolster their reputation and effectiveness?
I don't think that their reputation is at stake. I think that institutions of the Bretton Woods system have proven their worth. I think they are being challenged because of the fragmentation of the world as we see it at the moment. And it's almost conventional wisdom now to argue that the system is broken and that it needs to be rebuilt. I don't share that view, and I think that there has been so much accumulation of knowledge, of expertise, of talent, of goodwill with a mission associated with that a lot of it is actually solid and valid and should be kept, which doesn't mean that it shouldn't be changed. And there are lots of things that can be improved. And I think the institutions themselves, together with the help of the membership that is willing to move it forward, has to find ways to reform it in depth so that it becomes effective, efficient, and fit for the challenges that we have. But I'm not one of those who believe that international institutions such as the IMF, such as the World Bank, such as WTO, WHO, and you name it, are irrelevant. I think that the challenges that we are facing, it's not what you're saying.
I think they're essential myself.
Absolutely. And I think that they are even more so essential because we are facing issues and challenges of a global nature. And you might decide as much as you want that you will be fragmented, that you will go alone. That doesn't work. It doesn't work when you have pandemic. It doesn't work when you have major security challenges. It doesn't work when you need to have an international payment system. That works.
So we have all these global public goods, and this is why we need these institutions. One of the mottos of the Bretton Woods Committee is international policy, cooperation, coordination leads to better outcomes than countries going on their own. So how do we get people to understand that and lean in as opposed to pull back?
I think these institutions have to deliver. And you pick and choose the hill that you want to die on. I think you have to pick and choose the deliverables that you are confident you will offer to demonstrate the value and the worthiness of the institutions.
So presumably you have to make sure you have
crises are a good moment to actually show that.
Define the mission clearly and not too expansively.
I think the mandates are pretty clear for these institutions. I'm not talking about the UN, because I think that's a whole kettle of shit.
That has some serious structural issues, right? Yeah. We're not going to fix the UN
but
today.
But the ones we know well and the ones that are hosting us at the moment, I think that they know where the deliverables can be identified and can be offered.
Mm-hmm. Central bank independence has certainly come back into focus. I think people in the U.S. are probably quite jealous of the ECB setup where your independence is established by treaty. You've been a strong proponent of the importance of independence. What do you think is at risk if independence is compromised?
Well, the decision-making process and ultimately the quality, validity, and credibility of the decisions that are made. If investors or markets are under the impression that decisions are made because of political pressure to go in that direction or the other, I think that undermines clearly the credibility of the institutions. I think the independence is not a given. It might be in the treaty. It can also be in a law, but it has to be earned.
Yep.
And it has to be earned through transparency. How do you decide? How do you communicate the decisions that you have made? And I think it is also earned as a result of the accountability that you have when you go to Parliament. I go to Parliament on a regular basis. I take the questions. I answer all the members of Parliament, and we are fairly transparent in how we do it and why we do it.
So you would argue that the central bank has a role to play in sort of securing their independence by accountability, credibility, trust.
Yeah, you can never take it for granted. You really have to earn it all the time because it's a give and take. You are independent, but to earn that independence, you have to deliver on your mandate, but you also have to be transparent in how you do it, and you are accountable to those who ultimately have own the sovereignty of the territory within which you operate.
Where do you think the ECB is today in terms of its acceptance? So when the ECB was established, there was a lot of anxiety about
I remember that,
the Bundesbank was going to give up its inflation.
The Financial Times had all these things up.
So where do you think it is today?
Didn't happen, I'm sorry. We've celebrated our 25th anniversary not long ago.
Highly credible at this point.
Well, when I look at the popularity, if you will, of the euro, 82% of the European citizens value and trust the euro. The numbers are lower for the ECB itself because quite a few people actually don't know what the ECB is.
Everybody in this room does, though.
But to the extent that the euro is the currency that we are the custodian of, I think that to have that 82% is quite a tribute to the work that has been done by my predecessors, by the staff, and that I try to continue to emulate. And
that may even expand. I mean, people are talking about Hungary potentially, eventually.
Yes, that's a piece of good news because I heard the just newly elected Prime Minister of Hungary actually indicate that he will be looking forward to joining the euro area and having the euro instead of the florin. So this is the beginning of a journey.
Yep.
There will be work. There will be hard reforms, I'm sure. But to have this indication, which is not a political major decision. It's joining the family as was predicated at the time when the euro was set up. Every member of Europe, except Denmark. Denmark took a step out and carved out their right to stay out with their crown, but everybody else is expected to join. So we are 21. If we are 22, we just
You're making progress.
Yes. We have 4 more to go.
I'm going to switch gears again and ask you about crypto and decentralized finance. So the Genius Act was passed in the United States last year.
Now you are the expert, I'm not.
And established a framework for dollar payment stablecoins. Dollar-denominated stablecoins represent about 98% of all stablecoins outstanding. Do you think of dollar stablecoins as a threat to Europe in the sense of if people decide that they want to use dollar stablecoins for cross-border payments, then that'll make the euro less attractive? The European economy could be potentially dollarized. Is this something that you worry about? And two, how should Europe respond? How is the ECB thinking about what the appropriate response is?
Point number one, we at the ECB and within the euro system, we are 300% in favor of innovation, breakthrough, use of new technologies. And DLT, by the way, is not a new technology, but it's one that can certainly be exploited for the purpose of all sorts of payment representation of assets. But honestly, I don't understand the business case for stablecoins. Honestly. It's true. I don't. So, you can do tokenized deposit for a much better and more efficient purpose than these stable coins. But having said that, if people really want to use these non-business case devices and talk about it as if it was of huge value, let's see. But having said that, I think that it should be if it is done, it should be in compliance with the rules. So you are the expert on the Genius Act, I'm the expert on MiCAR. So between the two of us, we can probably cover the regulatory environment, except that they're not exactly the same.
No, they're not.
Right? So, and you're not yet done, and I'm not yet done, because you will have Clarity Act as well in the background. You'll have to make up your mind as to whether or not CASPs will be entitled to pay some interest to the stable coin.
That's extremely controversial. Yes. Big battle between the banks and
the crypto
I have
community. My bet on that, but I'm not going to. We'll share it later. So we are not completely done on the regulatory environment because MiCAR is going to be under review as well. But if these instruments, the US stable coins, Euro stable coins eventually, are to be considered as fungible, and therefore eligible to redemption in one place or the other, especially if they are multi-currencies, then it has to be exactly subject to the same kind of regulations. And I don't think that we can tolerate that, for instance, redemption of these multi-currency stablecoins be had in Europe, which could be siphoned very nicely simply because the outcome for the holder of the stablecoin is going to be more beneficial.
No, you need a level playing field.
You need level playing field, and you need to have a definition of fungibility between the two that is commonly accepted and that is, as you said, a level playing field. Because otherwise it's just, as a matter of principle, just not acceptable. You cannot transfer the risks to a redemption fund that is not operating under the same principle and with less supervision.
So Europe has laid down a set of regulations in MiCA, in terms of how this should go. Do you think that we're going to be able to get convergence between the European vision and the regulations that have yet to be written elsewhere? Because obviously, if you don't have convergence here, it's going to be very hard to get to that sort of harmonized world.
Yeah. Well, I think the business case has to be demonstrated, first of all. As you said, for the moment, 90% of the stablecoins are US dollar denominated. You have essentially two key players on the scene, one very largely dominant, the other one a little bit less so. And one is definitely trying to comply with the rules. The other one couldn't care less about the rules, okay? And, that's an issue.
No, I think that is a legitimate
I
issue.
didn't mention any name, by the way, huh?
I think most of the people can draw the inference. So how do we get to that sort of harmonized, regime? I mean, who's going to lead that? Is that a financial stability board? Is it the Committee on Payments?
I think the FSB has issued quite a lot of recommendations and guidelines in relation to stablecoins.
You also need the leadership of the countries to.
Yes, absolutely. You need to have. I can speak for Europe. You need to have the sponsorship of the Commission, and the sponsorship on the other side of whoever is going to come up. I guess it's Congress, from your perspective, wouldn't it? It's Congress and whoever is implementing and enforcing, and that matters as well, because you're in the sort of second layer of regulation.
Yeah, the central bank plays a role. I mean, especially the Federal Reserve, they've always been very, very important in the payment space.
But you have the Fed, you have the FDIC, you have the
it's more complicated here than it probably should be. Let's
okay, well, you keep saying that we are complicated, so I can tell you that you are less complicated.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. I'm going to switch gears once again. So financial stability risk, non-bank private credit. We've been reading more and more about non-bank private credit. How worried are you about the financial stability risks there? And what should we do about it? How can we mitigate those risks?
I think we should have more transparency, more data, more information than we have at the moment. Yep. So you hear one thing and the contrary. You have some who argue that it's the canary in the coal mine and we are heading towards disaster. Others who seem to be well informed who are saying, well, this is not systemically important and it's only 2-point-something trillion, so it's okay.
2-point-something trillion, not trillion.
Well, maybe a little less. Well, but that's the point. That's exactly what I'm saying. Some will tell you that it's 1.8, and others will tell you that it's 2.5. Well, the gap between the two is not totally insignificant. Yeah. But relative to the entire lending that is being given around the world, it is not that big a number.
So the first thing before is a lot more transparency. So we need more information.
Yeah.
Like who owes what to whom.
Exactly.
And
what are the points of interconnectedness with the banking system as well? Mm. And what is the level of information that is given to the retail investors in particular? Because I hear that there is a tendency to attract retail investment into those particular risks because they can be more reward. I think if people know exactly what risk they're buying into, that's fine. But retail investors are not necessarily the most informed investors to actually get into those businesses where liquidity is not necessarily as abundant as it would otherwise be in the banking system.
No, absolutely. I mean, there should be some sort of suitability test for sure. I'm going to talk about probably the most popular subject over the last 6 months, artificial intelligence. So central banks around the world are wrestling with what's the impact going to be on productivity, employment, inflation, both in the short term and the medium term. How are you thinking about it at the ECB? Are you thinking of it like this is really a benign, it's going to raise productivity, hold down inflation, 1,000 flowers are going to bloom, or are you more concerned about the disruptive impact?
Well, I think along two lines. First line of thinking, which is recent development really, is what risks are we opening ourselves to with the artificial intelligence that is currently being developed and which is at the forefront of innovation, invention, creativity, and potential risk. What exactly are we opening ourselves to? And I know I shouldn't be doing that, but there is clearly an artificial intelligence company that has currently alerted all of us
about the software,
about the latest software development and the risk that can be identified for good, or the risk that can be identified for bad. And I certainly think that all of us in the financial sector should be cognizant of that, be able to test it without risk, and certainly take the remedies and the precaution in order to mitigate those risks. So that's one line of thinking, which is recent development really, because that company has had the courage to say, whoops,
we may have a problem here.
We may have a problem, yes. I think the other line of thinking has been fed by much better thinkers than me. I'm thinking of Acemoglu, Simon Johnson, Krugman, and many others who are thinking about the consequences of artificial intelligence in terms of both productivity, improvement, alternative between job displacement and job enhancement, segregation of tasks, and how it is going to affect the jobs. And how are we going to deal with that? And I'm not sure that the jury is actually out. As I said recently, I think you have a group of economists who are working hard on this concept, and you find
there's a pretty wide range of views.
Yes. Both in terms of productivity, but in terms of consequences on the fabrics of our society. And the employment versus unemployment, the skilling, the reskilling, who is going to finance all that? And on the other hand, you have the large tech, the big hyperscalers and the new developers who rely on them or are partnering with them, who are saying that it's going to be nirvana. So
of course, they have an incentive to say that.
Absolutely. But I would say one thing. I would say that those developments are predicated on a world that is not too fragmented. Mm-hmm. Because if there is too much fragmentation, if data have to stay in particular corners behind certain walls, if money doesn't move too much because of further segregation, fragmentation, then this movement of artificial intelligence will find its limit.
How do you think about AI in terms of Europe's position? So it's really a U.S. story and a China story
as well,
competing with each other, and Europe is sort of not that competitive in this space.
Sometimes there's value in being a second.
Being a fast follower, is that sort of the model? Yeah, well, you may save a lot of money.
At some point in time, if the first line of thinking that I was referring to materializes, and if we face those risks of suddenly some of our health data management system or our international payment system or everything that is actually managed by software system that have been thought through in the last 20 years, if that is at risk, we are going to ask ourselves, and we will have to answer the question of the governance. Who is going to determine the use, the non-use, the barriers, the liabilities?
Yeah.
I was reading recently that Illinois is thinking of exempting all AI companies of any liability. I am sorry. I'm a lawyer by background. This is not possible. So.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone. I know we are running a bit over time, and we have a tough act to follow. So we're going to have a final conversation, hopefully to maybe change the tone a little bit of some of the discussions we've had today, and start thinking a little bit more forward-looking as well. Of course, we cannot ignore what is happening in this current moment, but we want to also think about how we move forward, how we can, think about what we heard today in terms of the macro backdrop and a lot of these shocks, the frequency, the severity, how we manage them in the near term, but also then what's going to come in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, and what the multilateral system might look like. So I'm going to quickly introduce our speakers, and then we're going to hear a bit about some forward-looking thoughts. We have with us today, very fortunately, Arancha González Laya, who is the former Minister of Foreign Affairs for Spain and is currently the co-chair of the Future of Development Cooperation Coalition, which we're going to hear a little bit more about. We also have John Lipsky, who you all know, Vice Chair of BWC and, of course, former FDMD here at the IMF. And Mari Pangestu, who is the Special Envoy to the President for International Trade and Multilateral Cooperation for Indonesia, former Managing Director of Development Policy and Partnerships at the World Bank, and also recently co-chaired a report on sort of reforming international trade, which we will hear a bit more about. So, as I said, in this current environment that we've heard much about today, and we also heard, both Ajay Banga and Lagarde just talk a little bit about how do we navigate this current period, but what does multilateralism look like going forward? Each of my distinguished panelists are starting to do some thinking around this, and I would like for each of them to share a little bit about the various projects that they're working on and thought leadership. So, Arancha, do you want to tell us a bit about this new project you're co-chairing and how you are viewing the state of international cooperation, especially as it relates to development finance?
So first, this conversation is about whether or not cooperation is possible today. And my very clear answer is yes, but it's changing shape. And if we are to foster it, to leverage it, we have to understand what these changes mean. So it's interdependence is there, the cost of not understanding that interdependence is there too. So international cooperation, and more specifically development cooperation, in my view, will continue. Now, it's going to be harder. It's probably going to be much more issue specific. It's going to be much more plural, because one of the features that we are seeing in this international landscape is that the idea of universality is breaking. It will be more plural, and therefore there's going to be more divergence. And one of the features that we will have to manage better is the costs of this divergence. I'll come to that in a moment. And it's probably going to be a more transactional international cooperation. Now, this is the landscape. So how do we, understanding that, again, this interdependence is still there, that we've got climate, that we've got a technological revolution ongoing with artificial intelligence, that we've got a demographic revolution ongoing too, and that geopolitics is leading to this fragmentation, to this pluralities. How do we manage that from a development cooperation point of view? This is the question that the Coalition for the Future of Development Cooperation that I co-chair with the former Vice President of Nigeria, Professor Osinbajo, and a group of individuals from all across the world have been tasked with answering. We will do this in our own personal capacity. We are not representing institutions, but we want to imagine what this development cooperation means in this more fragmented world. And how can we build a system where, if you think in terms of a balance sheet, we get to leverage the assets better and we get to manage the liabilities better. That's, in a way, the goal that we have set for ourselves. We will work for a long 1 year. We are doing this engaging with others. We see this as a process. We want to, we have as an ambition, we are not the only one working on this, as reframe the principles of international development cooperation. It's financial, but it's also non-financial in a large way. Let me give you an example. We've got 4 trillion in domestic assets in Africa. The assets are there. How do you unlock them? So it's not that we've got to print the 4 trillion. The 4 trillion are there. But what kind of regulatory mechanisms that we need, the trust mechanisms that we need, functioning markets that we need, regulatory frameworks that we need to unlock them. So I'm giving you this as an example of what we intend to do, principles and a new narrative for international cooperation in this much more transactional world, but also a few bold ideas that we would hope others to run with to unlock this capital that exists, but that we are not very good at unlocking at the moment, a better leveraging, so to speak.
Yeah, and we heard Ajay, talking about the work that the bank is doing, but we need to really accelerate the, I think, private capital mobilization piece, especially given the sort of ODA environment that we're in. I mean, you talked a little bit about the transactional and more sort of regional and plurilateral agreements, and I want to turn to Mari because this is something that you have said, you have thought as it relates to the trading system, and of course we are seeing that more and more. So tell me a little bit about some of your ideas around what is needed in terms of the global trading system reform, what is needed at the WTO in terms of reform to shepherd the systematic reform. And then given some of the outcomes that we just had at the WTO ministerial, how do you view the prospects for reform going forward?
Yeah, thanks for the question, and it's great to be here on a panel with very distinguished panelists. To answer your question, I think let me answer in 2 ways. One is from a very Southeast Asian ASEAN perspective, because apart from the 17-room future of multilateralism that I was co-chairing in Brookings, I also last year co-chaired the ASEAN Geoeconomics Task Force, which was in a way our effort to respond to what we saw was, the breakdown of the multilateral trading system and the nexus between economics, trade policy, and security, and all the geopolitics that went with it. And also in the kind of the WTO sense that consensus was causing paralysis, if you like. They're trying to reach consensus, and that is part of the reason for the failure of the last MC14. And finally, that we are living now in a multipolar world where it can't just be a few major countries leading the way, and we know that the retreat of one major country is the one that's affecting it. So the rest of us have to get our act together. We can't stand still. That's kind of the way we view the world. So if you start from Southeast Asia, of course the big shock that we have had to respond to was the reciprocal tariffs. But let me just summarize to you the 3-pronged strategy that we devised to respond to it. And it is also coming out as our recommendations under the Room 17, how should we approach the multilateralism in the future. We decided we are not China, so we can't retaliate. So we will have to negotiate, whether we like it or not, we have to negotiate with the US. But we agreed on some principles, that we would do it without harming each other and without harming our trading partner, our major trading partners, and that we would cooperate wherever we could, come to some common position wherever we could. And one of the really, I guess, hard one that was we were sort of in the end being able to come up with a common position was this very restrictive rules of origin to contain China that were embedded in the agreement. And I think we all managed to push back on that for it. That just to give you an example, right? The second thing we did was, you've got to, okay, we deal with the US, it is what it is. But we've got to get on with the rest of our trade, and we also still believed in multilateral principles and disciplines. So the second thing was to increase your domestic resilience by undertaking reforms, and a number of countries have been doing that. And second, to increase the trading part, your trade, as your trade is being affected by the US, let's increase trade with the rest of us. 87% of the world trade is, after all, without the US, right? So let's just increase trade with each other. Increase our regional economic integration, ASEAN, RCEP, CPTPP, lots of mega regionals. Plus, we accelerated our negotiations with the US, with the EU. And it was completed last year, and a number of other countries in ASEAN have also been negotiating with the EU. Final one was, this is at the leaders level, we recommitted to the multilateral rules and trade disciplines. And even though this is not yet done, but at least it's on paper as a commitment, that we would be acting as agency, you know, in the vacuum of major countries leading the multilateral trading system and multipolarity. It's up to the middle powers and taking the agency to continue to push for the multilateral rules, not just in the WTO reform, but in the way you undertake your regional integration. So that's, let me just close on what we have come up as principles, if you like, in the exercise we did recently on the Room 17 report. What we are calling an approach which is called constructive incrementalism, which is very similar to what you just proposed, you know, pluralist approach, because you can't get consensus in the WTO. And it is about not rejecting multilateralism. It is a pathway towards it. After all, even WTO only started with a 20-something countries, and then now it's 160 countries. So the 8 guiding principles, with some examples, are, first, I think we have to reaffirm sustainable development as the system's core purpose. This was one of the issues we discussed a lot, because climate and sustainability demands a different kind of trade system, which is not yet addressed under the current multilateral rules. Adopt a realistic approach to building broad foundations. And this is maybe the important one. Designed to expand, not exclude. You heard about open clubs? Coalition of the willing, open clubs. So you agree amongst a small like-minded country, but you don't make it exclusive. Those who don't even want to join yet can still be observers in your process. And someday, maybe they will join. Advance variable geometry. Arancha will remember this from WTO days. Basically, what it is move where you can on issues of whatever that you can. So coalition of the willing, plurilaterals, regional agreements, and so on. Respect regional integration. So I come from a region where we have been the habit of cooperation through regional economic integration has been what we have been going through for the last 20, 30 years. So this is building blocks rather than stumbling blocks. Invest in leveling the playing field, broaden technology transfer, and rebuild trust through demonstrated fairness. So I think MC14's limited outcomes, you asked me about the prospects, actually reinforces this case. You know, because where coalitions moved on fishery subsidies, on SBS and TBT, progress was possible, and even if it's not perfect. But where universal consensus was being asked or required, such as e-commerce, TRIPS, the overall declaration, this is the first time, is it, Arancha? No communique coming out of a WTO ministerial meeting. The system just locked up. So the consensus that is the basic principle of the WTO and member-driven and so on needs to be changed, but in a responsible way, obviously, not to exclude developing countries. Let me end there. That's probably too much information, but I think the key word is constructive incrementalism. Move where you can. and push the expansion to make it very inclusive, to have more and more countries agree on different issues across the world.
Yeah, I think, in this moment, there's a growing recognition that constructive incrementalism, pragmatic multilateralism, whatever you want to call it, is what is needed to continue to make progress and maybe be this sort of building blocks approach towards broader-based multilateralism again. So I want to turn to John and ask him sort of, Bretton Woods Committee is starting to think about this. You and Nancy and I have been, having some conversations about how do we use this building blocks approach to get to broader-based agreement again, and where did it break down? Right? How did we get here?
How did we get here?
Yeah. So you want to share a little bit about
I'll say a few
our
words.
thinking?
Very high level. Thanks. It's great to be on a panel with these two great colleagues and to hear the complexity of the challenges, and that it's not going to be simple to get back to rebuild a sense of greater coherence and effectiveness. So we started by saying, what is part of the underlying problem? And we have to recognize that there are structural differences between countries and how they construct their economies, that there are policy differences, even in addition to these structural differences. For example, in terms of structure is the difference in terms of role of the state and the role of markets in determining their economic outcomes. When we look at policy differences, we've heard a bunch, but also at a macro level. Yeah. We've been thinking about these. These produce spillovers. These differences produce spillovers. And these spillovers can become large enough that we would consider them excessive. And we can all agree that they can reach a point in which they produce a Pareto inferior outcome. In other words, a situation in which folks can be made better with nobody made worse. And at the same time, we have to recognize then there is not going to be some invisible hand that is going to guide the system back toward a Pareto superior outcome. That's going to have to be done through cooperative action. And the question then is, okay, what kind of process could we construct that would identify the problems that basically, take a step back, to say we want a rules-based system is well and good, but to think we could get agreement on detailed rules is a stretch. In fact, is probably not a good way to start. But what is necessary, or likely to be much more productive, is to construct a conversation, discussion, negotiations in which these trade-offs that we've heard implicitly in both earlier presentations can be discussed. And inevitably, there won't be a simple solution, but the issue is, can we engage in a conversation that produces conclusions that can be guided by, for example, an agreement on calculations of what the alternatives would imply. Now, for those who are listening closely, you might say, isn't that what the G20's framework on strong, sustainable, balanced, I don't know what else they've added, growth, wasn't that what it was supposed to be? And the answer is yes. Do you know anything about the framework in practice? Doesn't seem to be effective. So now the question is, okay, why hasn't that been effective? What is needed to produce ultimately an effective set of discussions and negotiations that will result in an agreement that on fairness that we can't expect to be an agreement on detailed rules that some arbiter is going to judge and impose sanctions. It's going to have to be a cooperative approach. And it seems likely to think of your incremental approach, is that able to produce a series of decision agglomerations that would help to rebuild a sense of effective multilateral cooperation.
So I think, what we're hearing is there's a huge political obstacle that has to be overcome as we think about cooperation going forward. And so what are the mechanisms for addressing, for convening the political level leadership to have real negotiations and real conversations? And I think the other thing that we're hearing is that these things would operate in silos, right? Trade policy, development policy, economic development. It's not siloed, it's integrated. So just all three of you maybe kind of how are you thinking about the integration of policy going forward at a technical level? And then how are we thinking about that also at a political level so that our politicians are seeing these things as integrated? Arancha, do you want to start?
The difficulty starts, the unit, the essential unit is the country that has to deal with all these different dimensions of the same issue. Now, it's true that globally we don't have the same unit at the global level, right? But I would say we first have to go back to a bit of the basics. Why does it matter today that we keep these spaces for cooperation alive? Because some are questioning this very fundamental principle, right? So, it's cheaper, it's safer, it protects your interests. So you don't want to do this because it's good for others, do it because it's good for you. So we've got to go back to this more enlightened self-interest. We call this transactional, but transactional may end up not being bad if we frame the context of this transaction. The second point I would tell you is it's true that those of us that have been constructing those universal systems that had as a goal the convergence of all countries, all economic systems, all social protection systems, all sustainability protective systems, we are kind of vested into that. But the new world does not look like that. It's much more plural, it's much more diverse, and it's much more about managing divergence. Okay. And one of the things that we need to understand, and this is, in my view, very important for the Bretton Woods institutions, is that divergences have costs. And one of the missions of these institutions is to make these costs explicit and help manage the costs that come from divergence. And of course it's a little bit more complicated to say that your mission is to keep divergence under check, but this is the reality. If I look at the World Trade Organization, one of the big missions of the World Trade Organization moving forward will not be to do big market opening. It will be to help governments manage the risks of divergent trade policies. So, there are spaces where these institutions still remain extremely relevant to help governments not to go completely crazy in this plurality that they seem to want to embrace these days.
Mari?
Well, I've spent the last year especially, but also before that, I think we were struggling a lot because you were talking about silos. Yep. Certainly that's part of the challenges we had. This nexus between economics and security, which was like growing and then really became very, very much in front of us as part of the shock we faced last year. That was a very hard conversation to have because, just within academic world, the economists were not talking with the international relations people. And so we started a process actually where we started talking to each other, trying to understand both sides. And then within government structures, and within regional mechanisms talk about WTO, it's not there, right? But it's beginning to happen. And I've been, just to give you an example, with the ASEAN work we did last year, and then just recently we had a bilateral meeting between Australia and Indonesia. The main conclusion is that we have to recognize that the economic and security nexus is here to stay. How do we manage that? And how do we have rules? How do we understand it? That concentration or vulnerability is a real thing. If you don't want to be dependent for one particular good from a particular country, then that's a real security concern. So you can have policies to reduce the vulnerability, but not at the cost of distorting trade. And not at the cost of over-securitization of everything. So and how do you put guardrails on that? That's been kind of the conversation we've been having. And some of the recommendations that have come out, for instance, is how do you put guardrails on the security clause in the WTO? Because that's now being used very liberally. A country can just say, I'm doing this restriction because it's in my security interest. How do you put guardrails around that? And interestingly, in the ASEAN mechanism, you're very right, silos, the economic ministers meet, the foreign ministers meet, the finance ministers meet, and there's no...
The three of you would never have spoken to one another in your sort of silos, right?
But we had a revolution last year because we were pushing this economic and security nexus, and we came up with this geoeconomics report. And guess what? For the very first time, the ASEAN economic ministers and the ASEAN foreign ministers met jointly to discuss this. And I was a trade minister for 7 years. I was never invited to the foreign ministers meeting. You were a foreign minister. I don't know whether you were invited to the trade minister. And it was kind of a revolution, both sides start seeing what needs to be done to manage this, because it's not going to go away. This security and economic nexus is not going to go away. How do you manage it, and how do you put guardrails around it so you don't have that over-securitization? And what are the disciplines and rules in the WTO or even in your regional agreements that you need to have? So it's still a big challenge. We have not managed to get the finance ministers. Yeah. and G20 is finance ministers. There's no link there. We have challenges on G20 this year for other reasons, but maybe you can speak to that. But I think we are a lot of our usual forum and the way we need to do dialogue also needs to change, but it does need a bit of a revolution, I would say.
Yeah, yeah. John, this is something we've been talking about, this sort of integration of issues, non-siloing. How do we create forums and mechanisms where there can be that dialogue?
And this is going to be a challenge, as we can hear. There's even within individual governments, right? Yeah. It's not simple. We probably need to start where we can start usefully, and in this case, it seems to me that the existing multilateral institutions, rather than being viewed as outmoded or passé, ought to be able to be used as a fundamental building block, again, of the kind of integration and conversation and ultimately negotiation that is going to be necessary, because certainly at some point there needs to be an independent standard setter who can judge what works. If we're seeking in a complex situation to produce Pareto superior results, i.e. things that will make everybody, at least everyone, better off and nobody worse off, which we think is possible, which I think we all think is possible in the current circumstances, eventually somebody is going to have to be an authority. And if anybody is going to be, and if this is going to be successful, I think it's going to be the multilateral institutions. But if we got a long way to go to think about how can we integrate a view on spillovers of these very complex varieties and that occur simultaneously. And it's a little bit like four-dimensional chess, isn't it? But it's necessary.
Yeah.
But it's necessary.
Yeah, and I think we heard earlier from the speakers, managing the current shocks while not forgetting to pay attention to these foundational structural issues, so that we can ensure that there is a durable, enduring system going forward. So, like Ajay Banga said, walk and chew gum. Okay, I think we're out of time, and I don't want to keep people between food. So we will wrap it up. But if you could join me in thanking our panelists, and just thank you everyone for joining today.